Hey everybody, what's up? It's Joe here. Just wanted to let you know about an upcoming class we have going in Denver. We're actually producing a Navigating Psychedelics 2-day edition for all of you out there that want some in-person ed. So we just ran it in Miami and it was an amazing success. And we're going to do it again in Denver on November 10 and 11. And we would love to have you there. If you want to learn about it, psychedelicstoday.com/events. We are going to run through 2 days of material. We're actually even going to give you an impressive breathwork experience that hopefully helps you understand that experience and how it's useful. So anyway, go over to psychedelicstoday.com/events to learn more, and we would love to see you there in Denver.
Vital, our 12-month practitioner training program, is back for its third cohort starting January 2024. The last 2 cohorts have been nothing short of transformational, both personally and professionally, for everyone involved, and here's a little taste of what makes it so special. Vital is a process-oriented curriculum, focusing on multidisciplinary perspectives and wisdom traditions, guiding students through powerful inner work and building practical skills to support lifelong growth. Through lectures, study groups, elective modules, retreats, and process papers, you'll have all the support you need to develop your own vision and model for entering this exciting field. Applications for Vital are open until December the 20th, with early bird discounts available until November the 19th. We invite you to apply early to improve your chances of being accepted into this global community of the next generation of psychedelic wellness practitioners. So, head to vital.psychedelictraining.com to download our full course curriculum and learn more about this transformative journey.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. I'm here with Imran Khan. Actually, I was trying to decide how to say your title. Are you the head of the UC Berkeley Psychedelic Project?
I'm the executive director of the UC Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics.
I love it.
BCSP.
BCSP.
Yeah.
I like it. So it got a lot of attention when it got founded. But before we even jump in, I want to talk about you. Like, who are you? Where do you come from? And that kind of stuff. So can you give us a little bit of your background, academic career, and like kind of how you kind of came forward? I can interject some fun questions for you too.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So as you can probably tell from the accent, I'm not native to the US. I grew up and spent pretty much all my life in the UK. So from a town in the north of England called Manchester. So if there's any Manchester United supporters out there, give me a shout. But yeah, born and raised in Manchester, and then got my first degree in biology from University of Oxford. And I was one of those people that really, really, really loved the science and loved the kind of intellectual stimulation and the ideas, but didn't think I quite had the patience to go and become a scientist researcher myself. So I was scouting around for other ways to apply my interest and really liked the idea of communicating science to other people and kind of sharing my passion that way. So I went and got a degree in science communication from Imperial College in London. And that kind of set me up for a really interesting career, starting in science journalism, so writing for newspapers, doing some podcasts. And then I kind of fell sideways into science policy, so trying to work out what happens when science and politics collide and clash. And I used to work in the UK Parliament for a while. And that was actually my first brush with psychedelic policy. So I'm happy to tell you more about that later. But then I had a really interesting kind of 10, 15-year career at the intersection between science and society. So trying to make that relationship easier, because it crops up in so many ways. Everything from climate to vaccines to AI to psychedelics. Ultimately, all of this is about what happens when people make advancements and insights and new findings in academia, and society has to figure out how to deal with that. And I've always found that a really compelling question, and one that I think sometimes neither scientists nor people like policymakers are necessarily well set up to try and solve. So try to be a bit of a translator between those various groups.
Awesome. Yeah, so let's dig in. Would you mind sharing a little bit about that early glimpse into what politicians had going on in the UK?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this was back when I was what feels now very young. So I was like 22, 23 years old. I'd just got that master's degree in science communication. I was this kind of bright-eyed young person that thought, here I am, having learned how to A, do science, and then B, communicate to other people. I'm ready to be kind of let loose on UK policy making and make sure that all policy making is firmly grounded in the science and the evidence. Right. And it just so happened that there was a member of parliament in the UK by the name of Dr. Evan Harris. And he used to be representing a party called the Liberal Democrats. So you may know in the UK, there are two main parties, Labour on the left and Conservatives on the right. But there is a small third party called the Liberal Democrats, who are kind of, social democrats, very liberal, kind of progressive, interested in things like, social liberties, but also kind of protection for rights and all that kind of stuff. So Evan was representing his party, and before he became a politician, he was kind of unusual that most politicians in the UK come from business or law or, those kind of backgrounds. And Evan used to be a medical doctor, so he used to work in hospitals, and then he kind of became a politician. So unlike most politicians who, when they're trying to staff their offices, try and find people like, history graduates or people that have worked in politics before, Evan really wanted someone like me who's kind of au fait with science, because that was his brief. He was the health and science spokesman for his party. So I got recruited by him, and that was a eye-opener, jaw-dropper, all this kind of stuff about, how the sausage-making machine works and how policy really gets made. And I learned a lot very quickly. But one of the things that still to this day kind of blows my mind was the way in which drug policy gets made. And I should say that at this point, I was totally straight edge. I grew up a very religious conservative Muslim in a kind of very conservative part of the north of the UK, and definitely had not been offered, let alone kind of touched any kind of drug before. But we were faced with this issue of the way in which UK drug scheduling worked is that the government had an independent advisory committee called the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, very grand British name for what's essentially an academic committee that says, here's what the evidence says. And at the time, this committee was chaired by a chap called Professor David Nutt, who many of your listeners may recognize the name of. And David's day job was and still is being an independent academic at Imperial College London. So he's a neuropsychopharmacologist. He researches drug harms and the neuroscience of how drugs operate in the brain. And as this effectively side gig, he was also chairing this national body that was responsible for collating the evidence on drug harms and telling the government what that meant for, should this drug be in Class A or Class B or Class C, which is, the equivalent of US drug schedules. So while I was kind of relatively new in this job of trying to advise my MP on how science gets used in policymaking and, what we should be looking out for, David came under fire for, if I remember correctly, basically just saying that the government was rescheduling cannabis to be in a higher schedule. And he came out and said that that wasn't necessarily supported by the evidence on harms, and it was effectively politically motivated rather than motivated by the evidence. And the government came down on him like a ton of bricks, saying, this is kind of lobbying. It's not just saying what the evidence says, blah, blah, blah. And, he got his knuckles wrapped. And there was this whole question about, what was the role of independent scientific advice, if not to give independent scientific advice. And then that kind of blew over for a few months. And it then came up again. And it turned out that before David had taken on this role, he had published a paper in a journal. And the paper was called Equicy, EQUASY. And I wonder if I could just read you a short excerpt from that journal.
Please.
So the paper is called Equicy, an overlooked addiction with implications for the current debate on drug harms. And kind of on the first page of this paper, David's writing, the dangers of Equicy were revealed to me as a result of a recent referral of a woman in her early 20s who had suffered permanent brain damage as a result of Equicy-induced brain damage. She'd undergone severe personality change that made her more irritable and impulsive, with anxiety and the loss of the ability to experience pleasure. There was also a degree of hyperfrontality and behavioral disinhibition that had led to many bad decisions in her relationships, with poor choice of partners and an unwanted pregnancy. She's unable to work and is unlikely to ever do so again. The social costs of her brain damage are quite high. So what was her addiction? What is Equicy? It's an addiction that produces the release of adrenaline and endorphins, and which is used by many millions of people in the UK, including children and young people. About 10 people die a year, and many more suffer permanent neurological damage, as had my patient. It's been estimated there's a serious adverse event every 350 exposures, etc., etc. So he goes on to talk about all the terrible effects of this thing called Equicy. And then he asks, have you worked out what Equicy is yet? It stands for equine addiction syndrome, a condition characterized by gaining pleasure from horses and being prepared to countenance the consequences, especially the harms from falling off/under the horse. So he's basically making this kind of analogy between MDMA, also known as ecstasy, and horse riding, which he's termed Equicy, and directly comparing the harms and speculating that actually, if you look at it a certain way, the harms associated with horse riding far exceed the harms associated with MDMA, which was then and still is considered this extremely harmful drug and is, Class A in the UK and is seen as a kind of incredible social harm. So I think he wrote this paper before he became a government advisor. And some enterprising journalist who noticed the recent brouhaha over the cannabis stuff dug it up and said, well, look, now David is also campaigning against government policy on MDMA. And I think this is a case of government ministers saying that, well, this has happened again. And they fired him from his role as independent advisor and chair of this advisory council on misuse of drugs. So I'm sitting there as this kind of 20-year-old. All I'm there to do is care about how science works and how do we protect the voice of scientists in policymaking, and how do we ensure that that policy is informed by the evidence rather than going in the face of it. And right in the middle of that, this very high-profile scientist basically gets sacked by the government for basically just saying what the science says, which, as far as I could see, was all he was being asked to do. So Evan and I and a bunch of other campaigners in the UK basically teamed up to try and make sure that in the future, if that kind of thing happened, the government would have to be really clear that when they are disagreeing with independent scientific advice, they're not saying the science is wrong, and they're not calling into question whether or not the scientist should be able to say what their research says. Because that would be a bizarre scenario. That would be saying, yes, you can come and advise us on what the research says, but you can't still be a scientist. So that was my first brush with policymaking, and the kind of the end result is that David was not reinstated. I think he'd kind of had enough anyway, and he kind of went back to many other fantastic things that he's doing, and I had the pleasure of seeing him recently at the MAPS conference in Denver, which is really lovely. But that was the first thing that really switched me onto this question of how alien the political debate is on drugs and drug harms and drug policy versus where the science is and what the science says. And it just started me kind of questioning, well, what are these substances, and why are they having such diametrically opposite views in policy versus research?
David Nutt's a great place to start.
Always.
That's super interesting. So that was kind of like the gateway into something curious is going on here. This is a really fascinating thing. And I think that's an age-old thing, right? Science versus whatever politicians want to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like scientists should really have plenty of runway to do their thing. And it'd be lovely if there wasn't really encroachment or whatever else, but
absolutely,
it would be nice if the data was clean and unbiased too sometimes, right? And we've seen some of that.
Yeah. And let's not pretend that, scientists are always kind of completely above the fray, and there's all sorts of interesting biases and complexities in academia. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, I feel like when science and politics collide, it does lead to some really interesting outputs.
So where did you go from there? Like after you're out of school, like did you jump into more journalism, you said? Yeah, so I started in journalism, and I was doing some writing for some papers, and then got attracted into this role in policymaking and kind of being in the thick of it when it comes to how UK politics was being done. And then from that, I this question of what happens when science and politics collide kind of radicalized me. So I feel like I was kind of really, had my eyes opened by the David Nutt incident and wasn't able to kind of really look back. And then I ended up running an organization in the UK called the Campaign for Science and Engineering, CASE. And it had a very similar remit. So it was saying that particularly when science comes under attack, so whether that's funding for scientists, whether that's free speech for researchers, whether that's how science is taught in schools, we had a small group of, it was just kind of 4 or 5 of us that tried to represent the UK science sector and do campaigning, lobbying, advocacy for science in the UK in terms of policymaking. It was a really interesting time to be doing it. So I was there around 2010, which was around the financial crash.
And as with the rest of the public sector in the UK and elsewhere, there were kind of huge swinging cuts to public sector budgets everywhere. And one of the things we were really concerned with was how do we make the case that if you cut science spending at this time, it actually kind of cuts off the recovery as well. It has all sorts of these long-term deleterious effects. So that was a big, interesting thing to be working on. And from that, I then went on to become chief executive of the British Science Association, which is this kind of one of these old Victorian era bodies in the UK. It was originally known as the British Association for the Advancement of Science, founded in 1831. And the main thing it was charged with was trying to improve the relationship between science and society. So it had this annual festival every year where it would expose the latest science to the public and vice versa. We did a lot of work with educators. So, one of the questions we had was that for many science teachers in schools, the last time they themselves were doing science was back in high school. And then they are, age 25, 30, 40, whatever it might be, teaching science, but not necessarily feeling that confident in it. So we tried to help with that and make it easier for them to lead extracurricular activities, have them be coached and supported by working academics and scientists in their work teaching students. And we did some work with the media as well, so training scientists to be better media spokespeople. So that was a fun few years.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's one thing to publish.
Yeah.
Largely, I think like the comments, how many people are actually reading what you publish?
Yeah.
Versus like if you get to go on some big media tour and like do a good job in front of the media, the impact can be so much deeper.
Absolutely. I think one of the problems we have as well is that, again, I got my bachelor's degree in biology, so got my kind of basic scientific training. And then I think of my master's degree in science communication as rehab for scientists, because at least in the UK, you're taught, so, we don't have a system of majors and minors, you basically just do biology. And I think part of what the scientific training does is force you to speak and write and communicate in terms that are unintelligible to ordinary people. And then you come out of this having to, writing all these scientific papers in this kind of bizarre third person objective abstract way that's kind of couched in all these kind of different terms that are kind of very strange. And people forget, and I think are trained not to communicate in terms that ordinary people can even understand. And I think there's all sorts of interesting incentives for why that might be.
Heard that about business school as well,
yeah,
for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fun. And I think really helpful, obviously. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement in the psychedelic science space too, right? Like Robin does a pretty good job, but like imagine if he could really, really communicate, like that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, what came next after journalism? And the Science Foundations.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, I kind of moved into this line of work, which was running organizations that try to connect science and society. So, did that at the Campaign for Science and Engineering, did that at the British Science Association. And then next I worked at this organization called the Wellcome Trust. And Wellcome is, I think, kind of the third or the fourth biggest charitable foundation in the world. So they're not very well known in the US. But if you imagine a cross between the Gates Foundation and the Howard Hughes Medical Initiative, so this huge endowment, and their mission is to improve health through research. That's what Wellcome did. So kind of spending kind of $1 to $2 billion a year, mostly on scientific research. And I ran a program for them called Public Engagement, which, spotting a theme was about this question of Wellcome's funding all this research. What good does it do if the public or patients or communities don't know about that research, don't trust that research, don't feel like that research is valid and relevant to people like them. So I was funding a program that was looking at those questions of how do we use other modes, things like art and theatre and music to communicate research? How do we delve into what makes science trustworthy versus not trustworthy? And how do we support scientists to build trustworthiness into their research? And again, similar questions about basic communication skills and working with the media too. So I spent a few years there, and then during the pandemic, had this really big life change where I decided to move to the US. My wife's from here in California, and we decided we were going to be here. And along the way, I was kind of faced with this question of, well, I'm moving all the way to California. What am I going to do next with my work? I'm still really passionate about science. I'm still really, I think, organization building and organizations, institutions are really important. But I also kind of missed the work from when I was younger doing my degree of like just being close to the research. And I feel like the further I'd got in my career, the more I was abstracting away from the compelling science, the new findings, the kind of the interesting work going on inside science. And instead I was focusing on these kind of meta policies of like at a national or international level, how do you design funding systems and how do you design education systems and what frameworks should you put in place to do X, Y, and Z? And I really wanted to kind of get back to the research. And I remember that a few things. One is that the thing that compelled me most about in my undergraduate degree, if I ever had gone into research, I think the thing I would have wanted to go into was neuroscience, and particularly the neuroscience of consciousness. I also really loved things like evolution and infectious disease and all that kind of stuff. But
why was there a hook for consciousness for you think?
Great question. I mean, I feel like maybe this is just me, but I want to say that it's really hard to look at the experience of being human and this kind of amazing, vivid Technicolor experience we have of walking around and doing everything from, drinking coffee to walking a dog to looking at, a sunrise, and not being totally bemused that experience can be generated by this 2-pound lump of mostly water with a bit of kind of fat and protein mixed in our skulls. Like that just seems like an insane proposition to me. So I remember when I was learning about that in my undergraduate and kind of trying to figure out the basic principles of neuroscience, it just seemed like this kind of amazing question of how can this ever be possible? This doesn't seem like it should compute. And back then, I think, a lot of the kind of the modern theories of integrated models of consciousness were still in their infancy. So people like, Christoph Koch were publishing work and trying to find things like the neural correlates of consciousness. And those, 20 years later still feel like kind of baby steps now. But I just remember being fascinated by them and just that question that we knew enough even then to start to unpick how this might be happening and start to speculate about what is the connection between brain and mind and consciousness. And then, experiences with psychedelics later as well, I think lead you to a similar place in that if you disrupt ordinary waking consciousness, you can almost start to see the way in which your brain changes its production of consciousness. And the idea that dramatic change can be induced by chemicals that we know the structure of and we can characterize and we can understand how they interact with the brain. Again, just feels like an interesting kind of chink in that kind of bigger question of what is consciousness and who are we and how do we relate to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I love that. And I think on the biomedical side, it's like a really important question because the amount of suffering we could solve for if we understood it really well, but better and better and better.
Absolutely.
It's kind of like what we're seeing, right? We see, the acceleration of neuroscience research, like really helping us come closer and closer to solving some really intractable disorders, I think.
Absolutely. And, I've always been, I think there's, so when I was getting my first degree and kind of working on issues like science education, I remember there being big debates around evolution and, evolution versus intelligent design. And, I was coming at this from a background of having been incredibly religious. So, I grew up Muslim, used to pray 5 times a day, read the Quran, was very, very spiritual in that way. And then had a big crisis of faith in my teenage years. So when I was looking at these debates around evolution versus things like intelligent design, I remember coming up against this pushback about evolution, saying, well, if we use science to explain things like how flowers evolved and how ecosystems came to be, then we are reducing the beauty. We're taking something as kind of magical and wonderful as the natural world and almost dimming the light on the beauty by explaining it, and we should just appreciate it for what it is rather than try and constantly seek to understand. And I remember not feeling that way. I remember feeling that the more I understood about how the natural world might have come to be, and the more that we can explain and even predict natural phenomena, that was all the more wondrous to me. The idea that you can appreciate a rainbow, great, it's beautiful, but the idea that you can explain a rainbow and that we can understand so much of how the world fits together that we can predict when rainbows might happen, I've always found that to be mind-blowing. And I think the same thing is true about consciousness and psychedelics. I feel like I come across some views that by trying to delve further into the nature of the brain and the mind and how the brain produces mind and mind produces consciousness, that we are almost asking questions that shouldn't be asked. And that by studying the scientific and biomedical nature of psychedelics, we are reducing something magical into something physical. And I just take the opposite view. I feel like the more I learn about psychedelics, the more entranced I am by them. And the more I learn about, for instance, how, to your point, things like depression, anxiety, and PTSD, we can see the symptoms, we can see the outer branches of this tree, but what we can't see is how they're linked deeper down at the moment. And I feel like that's a really compelling proposition. The more we can understand about ourselves, the more beautiful it is.
Right. Like for whatever reason right now, could be your accent. Like Isaac Newton keeps coming up for me. It's like his kind of reverence for nature and like, how things are working. I think that's an interesting kind of like mystical yet scientific attitude of like, how can we, at the same time understand, let's call it creation for lack of a better word for Newton's time. Like you can understand like the beauty and the mystery of the thing even more.
Yeah.
It's when I started studying evolutionary biology, like it's not, it didn't remove the mystery. There's still mystery and magic there, right? Like you have like a theory about how you might explain it. But I don't know, like I think what a lot of folks in the psychedelic field might not totally understand is just we don't have a better framework for predicting outcomes right now than science. Like science is the best tool we have to help us understand like what's going to happen. And like that is probably I don't know. I don't hear people talk about it that way.
Yeah. I think one of the things that gets lost sometimes is we use the word science to describe a lot of different things. So in one sense, science can be the body of knowledge. So all the things that since time immemorial we've researched and understood about the world. Science could be understood as the scientific process. So this idea that you make hypotheses and you try and disprove them. And then, by knocking all the things that aren't true down, you end up with this sculpture of things that we have reasonable confidence are true. Or you could say science is the discipline. So it's, when you add up biology and chemistry and physics and astronomy, all these things together, then you get this thing called science. Or you could say science is the community. So the people who work in the scientific discipline, the universities and the funding systems and the businesses. And I think all these things can get a bit conflated. And in fact, they are different aspects of a phenomena. So, and this was really important to me in my last role, when I was working on things like trust in science. It gets boiled down to this really simplistic question of saying, well, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to vaccines, why don't people trust the science? And those are two really tricky terms. So trust and science. With trust, you could be saying, well, do I trust someone to be telling the truth? Do I trust someone to be honest about their incentives? Do I trust someone to have my interests at heart? And when it comes to science, we could be saying, well, do I trust the research to be true? Or I could be saying, do I trust the scientists to be ethical? There's all these different aspects to what trust in science could be. And, another example I would give is to say, would I trust my parents for financial advice? And there's different aspects of that because I say, well, I absolutely trust them to have my best interests at heart. And when it comes to, for instance, buying a house, I would trust my parents to have my interests at heart, but I would trust my realtor to have expert advice. And the trusts are very different. And there's different types of distrust as well, in that I might not trust the realtor to have my interests at heart, but I might trust them to know some stuff that's relevant to me. So I think you're right that when it comes to the understanding of what science is within the psychedelic space, I think different people are using that same term science to mean different things. So some of the nuances of what that debate is can get lost.
Right. Well, we could go off on this tangent for 3 hours. So let's get back on the rails here. So you land in California. You're thinking about what's next. Like, when did you move here?
I moved here during the pandemic, so I landed in December 2020.
That's exciting. Yeah. So how did this whole like UC project come to you?
Yeah. So I landed here and I took a bit of time out to think about other things. So spent a few months just doing some personal work and creative projects and, trying to kind of take a broad view and just get used to this amazing place. It's, I'd visited California a bunch before, but it was only when I moved here that I realized that it's one of the most beautiful places in the world. And, it just getting out of the cities and exploring and just being here was a real trip. But then, reality eventually came around and I was like, okay, I need to find a job. And I was delving into this question of, how do I align what I think I'm good at, which is, A, being a translator between science and the rest of society, and B, running organizations and teams and building strategies and implementing them. And then what I'm passionate and curious about. And, again, that's still this question of how does science relate to society, but also this deeper question of the mind and consciousness and the brain and, some of the stuff that we know tons about, including philosophy. And as I was debating that stuff, this question about psychedelics just kept coming up again and again. And I think it's moved on a bit now, but at the time in the UK, it never would have occurred to me that I could work in psychedelics. Like those, there's so much stigma and so much opposition that it just didn't feel like a realistic proposition. And again, I think things have changed a bit in the last few years, but it struck me when I moved to California that it felt like psychedelics were in the water. Like everyone was talking about them and researching them and working on them. And there was a couple of labs at UCSF that were working on them. And, Michael Pollan had, still doing a lot of writing and speaking after his book. So I actually, coming back around, I emailed David Nutt. So he and I had kind of stayed in touch and, become friends after we worked together on that campaign. And I said to David, look, I'm really interested in this question of whether I could combine my professional experience with the burgeoning field of psychedelic research and science, and what should I do? And he gave me a few pointers and people to talk to, and he actually introduced me to Robin Carhart-Harris, who'd also just moved from London to California, and Josh Woolley, who runs one of the psychedelic labs at UCSF, Tripper. And I spoke to both of them and did a bit of work with Josh at UCSF. And again, it was one of those things where the more I learn and the more I kind of appreciated about the context that psychedelic science is in right now, where you have this really compelling research, you have these kind of decades or centuries of kind of later knowledge and understanding, you have this really complex debate, well, what's going to happen when psychedelics meet politics and the law and the media and culture and religion and medicine. It just felt like that was this kind of amazing pressure cooker situation where you kind of need to disentangle this stuff. So I was thinking about all of that. And I just happened to be on LinkedIn one day and saw that there's this new center for the science of psychedelics at UC Berkeley, and they're looking for an executive director. And I was like, aha, well, this seems like a sign. And I applied and interviewed, and then I started the role in, I think it was May last year, so May 2022.
That's amazing. And what was the intent of the UC system when they were establishing this group?
So I think the question so I should say that the UC Berkeley Center for Psychedelics was founded by 6 faculty. So Michael Silva, who's a neuroscientist, Andrea Gomez, who's a molecular biologist, Tina Trujillo, who runs our training program, Michael Pollan, who wrote the book, but also is a professor of journalism at UC Berkeley, and David Presti and Daka Kellner as well. And the question they asked themselves when they were setting up the center was, what's missing? So there's all this interesting stuff going on, but if we're setting up a new center at UC Berkeley, rather than duplicating the amazing efforts elsewhere in the sector, how do we add something new and distinctive? And those 3 key things they said they wanted to focus on. One is understanding that there's tons of exciting clinical translational research going on, but we still understand amazingly little about the fundamental nature of psychedelics and how they interact with us and society. So one, setting up a research program that tries to ask and answer fundamental questions about what psychedelics are and how they work. B, training. So noting that if the psychedelic, I know people have complicated emotions about the word renaissance, but it's a word that's used. So I'll say psychedelic renaissance. If that continues, there is going to be this need and demand for trained facilitators. And again, we know remarkably little about what it takes to be a really good psychedelic facilitator. How do you create systems that create that work? How do you evaluate programs that train psychedelic facilitators? So build a program that does that. And then thirdly, this big question about public education. So there's already, I think, an unmet demand, as I'm sure you're finding out with psychedelics today, from people that want to understand everything from the relevance of psychedelics to them and mental health conditions, to kind of creativity and spirituality and productivity, to what they reveal about the mind and the brain and the whole psychonaut subculture as well. And it felt like that's only going to grow. And the need for genuinely evidence-led, science-supported, expert-informed information about psychedelics in the public sphere was only going to grow. And particularly given that that's partly where the centre came from in terms of Michael Pollan's interest, that felt like an obvious thing too. So the centre was founded to do those three things: research, training, public education.
I love that. Yeah, I use the term resurgence instead of renaissance.
Resurgence. I like
Seems
that.
more value neutral, historically neutral. Yeah.
Well, the thing I think about sometimes, if you think about the actual word renaissance, I mean, yes, it has connotations of the European Renaissance, but the word itself literally means rebirth. I think if I look at the literal meaning, it feels a little bit more neutral, but I know it has a lot of baggage. So,
and especially if you keep an eye on San Francisco.
Well, indeed, yeah.
If you're just in the Bay, it totally makes sense. Yeah. So you jumped in. You're the newly crowned ED.
Definitely don't have a crown, but thank you.
We'll get you one. So,
I'm very anti-royalist, so we can. That's another debate.
I love that. Yeah,
we call it Republican in the UK, but I think it means something different here.
A little bit, but I dig that. So, what did it look like when you jumped in? That you had to build the whole team and understand, set up programs and projects and all that?
It's a really interesting context. So, I've worked around science and research most of my career, but I've never worked in a university before. And this idea of how do you build effectively a new organization, new institution inside one of the world's leading public universities. UC Berkeley's got such an amazing reputation, is so vast and has this fantastic culture. And the question really is, how do we combine the capacities and expertise of independent academics at UC Berkeley who are doing this fantastic, compelling research or running these programs with also building what's effectively kind of a novel non-profit startup that can do things like build new programs and raise funding and run programs. So my challenge as executive director was to kind of pull together these threads of, we've got some research going on, we're running this training program, we've launched these few public education initiatives, and turning that into a kind of coherent organization that has its own identity and is more than the sum of its parts. So initially that's involved getting some of our really exciting initial projects over the line. So right in front of you there, you've got a postcard for our new online course. It's called Psychedelics and the Mind. So it's live for sign up right now. It's I think it's going to be a real game changer when it comes to psychedelic education. So the guy who leads it is Professor David Presti. He's been teaching a course at Berkeley called Drugs in the Brain for almost 3 decades, I want to say. And for most of that time, it's been one of the most popular modules anywhere on the Berkeley campus. So he's been pedagogically, this is kind of like the best of the best. And over the last year, we've been working with him to translate that in-person course to an online version. So we've got in an award-winning producer to kind of turn this into this amazing audio-visual feast that's available at edX, on edX. But if you go to our website at psychedelics.berkeley.edu, you can find all the details to sign up for that. So it was some practical things like getting that course finished and launched, and then also starting to kind of build a team to hire people that can run finances and comms and projects, and start to develop a long-term strategy for the center.
That's great. And what kind of engagement or I'm kind of curious about Michael Pollan and Tim Ferriss's engagement and kind of the starting up of the center.
Yeah. So Tim Ferriss, I should say that the center right now is entirely funded by philanthropy. So we're really, really lucky in that there's an amazing number of people out there in the Bay Area and beyond who really believe in the future of psychedelic science and bought into this vision of the center at Berkeley to help support that. So all of our programs, from the research, the training, and the public education, are supported by donors. Tim Ferriss is one of those. So he worked with Michael Pollan to come up with this idea of journalism fellowships. So again, within the public education mission, one of the questions we ask is, how do we foster good independent journalism? Because it's all very well having people in the psychedelic space who are evangelists for psychedelics. And I think that's absolutely needed. We need people who are passionate advocates for this field. But I think what we also need is kind of critical, independent journalism that can scrutinize and shine a light on both the good and the bad, and maybe even the ugly within the psychedelic space. I think in the long term, that will build trust. So people from outside the space will be able to see that, a light is being shone on the sector, and that it's not just people who are passionate about psychedelics, who are telling stories about psychedelics, but people who are more neutral and more skeptical as well. So one of the ways we do that is, again, through the journalism fellowship that Tim Ferriss funds, where we award a number of grants each year to journalists who want to cover interesting stories in the world of psychedelics. So psychedelics meet religion, or the science of psychedelics, or what happens when policy change happens. So that's been one of the things that's been really exciting to see and launch. And we've already seen that some of our fellows have been getting book deals. So Rachel Newer just launched her book. Oh my God, what's it called?
I just bought it. I Feel
Love. Yeah. So, deep dive into MDMA.
Oh, that's right. Jonas told me to get it.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So I think what we're seeing is we're not just getting individual stories out of these grants. What we're doing is creating this cohort of journalists who understand psychedelics, understand the science, the history, the culture, so that when stuff comes out in the future, whether it's good news or bad news or challenging news or complicated news, there will increasingly be a cohort of journalists that can report on that in an informed, expert-led way. I think that's
that
really
makes
important.
sense. I'm thinking about reading something like Popular Science, and somebody's writing about fusion or fission or something.
Yeah.
Like, that's not something just what a cold journalist can jump into.
Yeah.
You need like a primer on the whole thing, so you can be a translator.
Exactly. One of the other things we talk about a lot at the center is risk. Mm-hmm. So one of our kind of founding advisors is Bob Jesse. Again, a name I think will be familiar to many of your listeners. He's kind of one of the most wonderful, thoughtful people I know in the field of psychedelics. And he's really trying to kind of preach a lot right now about what I would call the dangers of perhaps irrational exuberance. This idea that, I think some people do see psychedelics, A, as having no downside, B, being a panacea for everything. I think since working in this field, I come across people who think psychedelics will solve climate change and political tribalism and end the mental health crisis and all this kind of stuff. And I feel like there is a risk that expectations, both on a social level and an individual level, are so sky high that they simply cannot be met, and that there'll be this kind of crashing down to earth. And in particular, when it comes to the use in mental health treatments, yes, there's this tremendous new data coming out, and we should all be very excited. But the same was true of SSRIs, and SSRIs have done tremendous good for probably hundreds of millions of people, but they're not without their downsides and risks and complications. And the same is going to be true in psychedelics too. So that question of how do we communicate risk, I think is a really important one too.
Yeah, I love that. So
the transition I was trying to make there is I think that, again, good independent journalism is critical for that. So at some point, as we see rollouts in Oregon and Colorado, and perhaps even through the FDA, if MDMA does get approved for psychedelic-assisted therapy, there are going to be some challenging stories. As a large proportion of the people that go for psychedelic-assisted therapy are going to be in really challenging mental health conditions. We would expect, as a matter of course, some of them to have negative outcomes anyway, whether or not they do psychedelic-assisted therapy. And we would also expect that, as with any clinical intervention, there'll be some people that either don't benefit or get worse. And how that's reported on, I think, is really important. For instance, one of the analogies I use is cars and driving. When there's a car crash, that gets reported on. And if there's a really big car crash, that gets reported on a lot. But no one reports on that in isolation. We kind of acknowledge the value of transport and the value of being able to get around as part of that debate. And I think it's really important that when tricky things do come out of the psychedelic space, and when bad news stories inevitably happen, we're able to focus on what can be done to improve that, but also focus on the broader context of what's the cost benefit here, rather than just what's the bad news.
How bad was it?
So was Tim more involved than just philanthropically at all, or?
So I think him and Michael Pollan did cook up the journalism fellowship together.
Yeah.
I think they're both kind of really passionate about that, and he's been great in kind of helping us think about the future of the centre as well. We're just about to launch next year a new round of fellowships. So Blake Mykowski, another one of our donors, he's funding us to do a similar thing where we're going to be doing journalism fellowships, but more focused on video. So trying to kind of create interesting content for different types of audiences. And again, Tim was great in helping us kind of knit those things together and seed that vision.
Love that. Yeah, that's really great. So back to the exuberance part. like we're like part of this whole project is our history, right? We're kind of digging our way out of a multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar kind of global war on terror. Sorry, not terror, drugs. But it was kind of like the way it was executed was kind of like a a scary scene.
Yeah.
So we need really good journalists, but like the exuberance is kind of a reaction to that, right? So we came out of some darkness and everybody's like, oh, cool, light. And then all of a sudden we're like, no, we actually have to have a little bit more clear seeing here.
Yeah.
Clear storytelling. And
Totally.
and I wonder how far the pendulum's gone. Like I see it, I see that there's big factions inside the psychedelic space who only want to talk about the negative aspects and they're not willing to like take some sort of balanced position. Like there was one person who went to the MAPS conference and said, I had a great time, and that's the problem. It's like, what? Well, you had a great time. Like, I don't see the problem. You went to a conference and had a good time. Like, what? What are you talking about? Like, I guess people want more rain on the parade as part of it. So it adds more appropriate color.
Yeah.
But I do wonder, like, and since you're not necessarily, you're looking at more like mechanism of action work on the science side and like, what is happening in the brain and consciousness, et cetera. So it's like, there's some stuff there, but let's name some of the problems, right? There's like weird cult dynamics. There's, HPPD. There's like all sorts of, potential negative outcomes, personality types that are disorders that might not be good fits.
Yeah.
There's so many different things. Is there anything else just like big topic wise that we want to watch for, like in terms of like potential negatives?
One of the ones that's been reported on is this risk in a therapeutic context. So the risk of abuse. I think many of your listeners will have heard the Power Trip podcast, kind of with its allegations of abuse during the MDMA trials. And I think, I've heard some really important and interesting critiques of that journalism. But I also think some of the stuff that they uncovered is undeniable, that really bad practice happened and was perhaps not dealt with as it should have been. And I think what we can take from that is a few things. Abuse happens in almost, sadly, every walk of human life. It's impossible to put human beings together and for bad things not to occasionally happen. And therefore, we should expect that in psychedelic therapy, particularly when people are in such a vulnerable state, that in the future it will likely, sadly, happen again. And I think being blind to that is a really risky situation for us to put ourselves in. So I think the more that can be done to highlight that risk, to support victims, to put in place safeguards, to recognize that the systems we have right now perhaps aren't sufficient to protect people. That's a really important conversation to have, and just to think that psychedelics are so wonderful and so beautiful, and that everyone who works in this space is wonderful and beautiful, and that'll be enough, clearly is wrong-headed. So I think there's all sorts of risks that aren't necessarily just due to the kind of biological nature of psychedelics in humans, that we're not necessarily classifying as psychedelic risks right now.
Right, it's like the social dynamics, and like on that particular Yenton case, like the point I love to point out is proportionally, MAPS is performing in terms of like reported patient abuse like that way better than traditional psychiatry and therapy. Like their numbers are actually way safer. So like including figures like that in the story, I think is really helpful too. But obviously we need to figure out how to protect people. Like, I'm not comfortable being in a room as a facilitator without like a lot of safeguards. A lot. And it's more like my risk. Because stories can come out and all that. I'm not saying harm isn't happening all over the underground and like in shamanic context too, but they're everywhere. It's a tough thing to solve for. But like I like to consider it some sort of engineering problem. Like how do we solve for that in some kind of programmatic way?
Absolutely.
And I think getting people alerted of the risk. Like I had some people harmed and some friends harmed in some interesting groups around here. And I'm like, how do you solve for that? I think it's partly the education. Say you have to watch out. Like, hey, there's, it's tough, right?
Yeah. And I think it goes back to the kind of question you were posing a couple of minutes ago, saying that, is there a risk that there are some people in the movement that just want to talk about the negatives? And I guess I view it, if you take a step back, there are people on both extremes. There are people who are just looking at the positive and just looking at the negative. There's plenty of people in the middle who have kind of healthy skepticism and kind of interest and excitement. And the question for me is not whether or not there are some people who are perhaps too extreme at both ends, but as a field, as a sector, as a community, are we collectively shining an appropriate light both on the benefits and the risks? And I think what people like Bob Jesse are saying is maybe not, maybe that in terms of where the average is right now, it's a little bit too far towards the exuberance. And that part of the way we protect against people having negative incidents in the underground is by being clearer as a broad community that these are not panaceas, these are not without risk, that there is a kind of complex ecosystem that you're entering into here.
I want to talk a little bit about the kind of neuroscience side. So, obviously in philosophy and neuroscience, what do we call it? The hard problem of consciousness. And that's kind of the problem that's getting approached here, finally. We have these psychedelics that can be used as tools to understand the mind and brain far more than we ever really have.
Yeah.
Especially with, increasingly better magnet machines like MRIs, fMRIs, et cetera. We're finally getting the tools we needed to dig deeper. Did you see the recent article, philosopher and neuroscientist, their 25-year bet finally came to a close?
I did not. Tell me about it.
It was specifically about this.
Tell me.
So they made a bet 25 years ago or so saying the neuroscientist was pretty positive. Yeah, for sure. We're going to solve the problem of the mind, mind-body connection. What is the difference between mind, body, consciousness, et cetera. And the philosopher was like, no, I don't believe you are. Just the problem itself is how can this biological apparatus create this fantastical experience? It seems like it's too far of a leap. And 25 years ago, it was kind of more believable that we weren't going to solve it. Today, I'm like, it's kind of a coin flip if we're going to solve it. But I think we can continue making progress and at least get up to that edge, right?
Yeah.
And the way I kind of model it these days is kind of I think interesting scientists go towards two things, kind of origins of the universe or what is this consciousness problem? And it's kind of similar. You can get really close to the thing, really, really, really close, but you might not always get all the way there.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's some sort of event horizon or something. That's more black hole talk, but it's a similar kind of construct in the Big Bang talk. But how do we approach it? What are you optimistic? Or more curious?
I think I'm more curious. I feel like, whether we get there or not, it'll be an interesting ride. And I wanted to say a little bit about some of the research that's going on at Berkeley. So our faculty director, Professor Michael Silver, is a neuroscientist who focuses on the visual area of the brain. So, how does the brain turn the stimulus coming in through your eye and your retina into conscious precepts that we can actually experience? And I should say, I'm about to explain this, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm not helping Michael on his study. So if I make any errors there, my errors, not any errors in the research. But as I understand it, firstly, we understand a decent amount about the visual cortex. So we know that there are bits of the visual cortex. So if you kind of put your hand on the back of your skull, just above your neck, kind of that bit just underneath your palm is the bit that's kind of responsible for creating your visual experience. It's kind of funny that it's so far away from your eyes. But we know that there are certain groups of neurons in there that are responsible for instance, detecting edges. There are certain groups of neurons that are responsible for, spotting movement. So it's an interesting kind of model for understanding how conscious experiences are created. And I think it's especially interesting given that, so much of the psychedelic experience can change our visual experience. And we still don't really know how that happens. Firstly, although we know some of how that bit of the brain creates visual perceptions, we don't know why it should necessarily be the case that psychedelics might change that. And again, many of your listeners will know some of the theories coming out of research like Robin Carhart-Harris, who's suggesting that part of the way in which psychedelics work is by reducing the influence of neural priors. So again, this might be treading over old ground for many of your listeners, but one of the things we are reasonably sure of is that your brain isn't working like some kind of fancy camcorder. So it's not as if you're just making this kind of ongoing film of what's going on out in the world and then creating a version of that. What your brain is actually doing is constantly making predictions about what's going on in the outside world. So an example of this is the phenomenon called color constancy. So if you imagine picking up a shiny red apple, if you hold that apple up to the light and look at it, it will look red. But actually, if you pay close attention to some of those colors, you're probably picking up lots of bright white light because the apple's so shiny that much of what you're seeing is actually white. And again, if you then put the apple kind of underneath your chair and look at it again, it will still look red, even though the actual colors you're receiving off the apple are completely different because the light has changed. Nevertheless, you still see that apple as red. So what your brain is effectively doing is saying, I've seen apples a tons of times before. I've seen them in all sorts of different light conditions. I know what different light conditions mean. Just because the apple looks light in one situation and looks dark in another situation doesn't mean it's not still an apple. So your brain is using its prior experience of apples to tell you, despite different types of color information coming in, that's still an apple. Another example I like to think of is if, we've got a small vase of flowers on this table here. I can only see the front of that vase, but I don't think it's a two-dimensional object. I've seen enough objects in my life to know that because I can see the front of that vase, and I've seen lots of flowers and vases before, that probably has a back, and it probably looks similar, and it probably looks like the back of a flower, even though I don't know for sure right now. So again, what my brain is doing is making predictions about what's going on the other side of that vase. And what Robin Carhart-Harris and others are suggesting is that part of what psychedelics are doing is reducing the influence of priors and saying that, yes, you've got this years or decades of experience of looking at colors or three-dimensional objects or straight lines. And under normal circumstances, your brain would use that experience to fill in the gaps. What psychedelics are potentially doing is reducing the influence of those priors and forcing your brain to rely more on the kind of the raw experience coming in through the outside world. So Michael Silver, who's our faculty director, is testing this theory, rebus, the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, by showing people what's called a bistable stimulus. So it's a visual stimulus that could be interpreted in one of two ways. So if you've seen that classic image of something that could look like two faces looking at each other or a vase in the middle, and you can kind of interpret it in either way. And once you see one, it's kind of hard to switch back, but you can switch back. Michael's going to be showing people an image a bit like this, where one of those bistable versions is more influenced by priors and another one isn't. And then he's going to be putting people in an fMRI machine, and some of them are going to be on low or high doses of psilocybin. And we're going to be firstly seeing, does your interpretation of that bistable image change when you're under the influence of psilocybin? And can we look at what's literally going on in your visual cortex neurons when that change happens? So again, trying to say down at the level of individual neurons in our brain, can we try and unpick what influences psychedelics are having in our conscious experience? I think that's really exciting.
Are there enough undergraduates that want to jump in?
We haven't started recruiting volunteers just yet, but we will be. But if you want to be amongst the first to learn, if you go to our website, again, psychedelics.berkeley.edu, and sign up for our newsletter, so go to contact us and click on newsletter, we'll be advertising the opportunity when it's available.
That's wild. I'm excited to see. That's really interesting. Yeah, it's one way I like to explain is it's really expensive to run this nervous system. So we look for rules to help us kind of save some energy.
Shortcuts.
So, like our perception is really shaded by those.
Yeah.
Generally.
Yeah. I'm really interested in the work of, again, some people might be familiar with this guy, but Anil Seth, Anilseth, is a neuroscientist based in Brighton in the UK. And he's done some really, really fascinating work on consciousness and the way in which it's a tool of our brain. So just as other things like pain or calculation or regulating our homeostasis, all of our body stuff, all of these things are tools that our brain has to stop us dying, help us make good decisions, and consciousness it's not really designed to be this kind of one-to-one perfect mirror of what's going on in the outside world. What it's designed to do is help us navigate and make some of our basic life decisions about where to find food and where to find shelter and how to find, community in a human context. So the thing it's good at is trying to solve those problems rather than trying to create a perfect picture of what's really going on.
Love that. What other kind of research projects might be coming up?
Let me have a think. So another interesting research project we've got going on is Professor Andrea Gomez. So she works with animal models and is trying to understand what are the kind of signs of neuroplasticity that are created when under the influence of psychedelics. So she is using CRISPR, which is a genetic tool, and other kind of forms of information gathering to understand both during the psychedelic experience in animal models and afterwards, how does gene expression change? So if you think about the fact that something like neuroplasticity, the idea that your brain structure is changing, that you're growing new neurons, the connections between neurons are changing, that implies some kind of physical process. There are proteins being created that weren't there before. There are some proteins that are stopping being produced. And that implies some change in the way our genes are being expressed. So trying to track what that actually looks like, which are the specific genes that are being turned on or turned off, or upregulated, downregulated, and what are the kind of molecular knock-on effects of that. So I think that's really fascinating as well, trying to characterize at a genetic level what psychedelics are doing to us too.
It's fascinating. So like this...
I say us, I mean mammals.
Would this count as kind of basic science?
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think people use different terms for it, kind of basic science, fundamental science, blue sky science, curiosity-driven research. But that's ultimately where we are. And I think in the future as well, we'd like to expand beyond the kind of biomedical. So, we already have this research program that Tina Trujillo is leading, which is evaluating the training program that we're running and trying to understand what makes a good training program, what's the experience of people who are on training programs. But I think there's so many interesting questions at the intersection of psychedelics and law, psychedelics and philosophy, psychedelics and sociology or archaeology, or a whole number of other things that aren't necessarily asking the question, what's the way in which we can use psychedelics to treat depression, which is a really, really important question. And there's tons of people looking at it. Not enough, I should say, but there's lots of interesting research going on. But I think there's a real deficit in the kind of more basic underpinning questions about what are psychedelics, how do they work, what happens when they interact with the brain, society, law, business. I think there's tons of interesting work to be done.
I'm a board member at the Psychedelic Medicine Coalition, and we're working to improve science funding from the federal government, who I think the U.S. federal government might just generally be the largest funder of science in the world. And just getting a small smidge of that to help us understand psychedelics in the brain and, the human experience would be pretty helpful.
I think that's actually one of the most important things that, certainly centers like the BCSP should be working towards in the future. And I'm so glad that your organization is working on that. I think so. All the research that we're doing right now, including the neuroscience research I just described, is being funded by philanthropy, which is great, and we're really grateful. But it's not long-term sustainable. That if you look at most high-impact sources of scientific research, that is supported by existing frameworks of science funding, and having the US government really support this work would be really important. And I think there are so many important questions to be asked. Again, your listeners will be familiar with this question, but the fact that psychedelic assisted therapy potentially has impacts on everything from depression to PTSD to substance use disorder to hearing interesting stuff coming out of UCLA about eating disorders as well. It's weird, right? It's strange that one type of therapy and one
to
type
keep
of
on the UCSD or UC train UCSD with pain.
Exactly. Yeah. Surely that can't be a coincidence. Surely there must be something interesting connecting all of these different experiences, these different disorders, these different facets of the human experience deeper in our mind and our brain. And the idea that shouldn't be at some point funded by national federal funding sources does seem strange to me. And I hope that we can get over this stigma and the kind of the lingering effects of government propaganda that are suppressing what is, I think, a really, really, really important type of research.
Yeah, let's figure out a way to get you in front of Congress. I did a day out there, and like the it was really just surprising how easy of a pitch it is when you have, you know, university data to help.
Yeah.
Oh, within the last 5 years, this is what these leading universities say.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the interesting things I noticed when we were in Denver just a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, speaking to you now in July, and the Psychedelic Science Conference wasn't that long ago. And it was interesting being there and representing UC Berkeley and just having so many people say, oh, wow, really glad UC Berkeley's here. And it kind of, you know, I feel like it's almost easy for me and my colleagues take it for granted being in the UC system. They're like, oh yeah, we're at university, we're doing research, this makes sense. But I think for a lot of people in the sector, it's still a kind of a notable new development that organizations like Berkeley, like, you know, all the different parts of the UC system, like other research R1 universities across the US and around the world, are actually taking this stuff seriously, that it's not fringe, it's not counterculture, that it is being researched at the highest levels. I think hopefully that will help convince the parts of our society that are perhaps more skeptical and more concerned.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I love that. So the work you're doing really, and a lot of the other UC groups and other big universities, it just helps move the whole thing forward, whatever it is that it's going to turn into.
Yeah. And again, I think, you know, especially being part of university, you know, we don't see our role as to be out there advocating or evangelizing or kind of proselytizing for psychedelics, but we do see our role as saying, these are really important and interesting and fascinating. At the very, very, very least, we should be taking them seriously, and we should be asking important questions, and we should be doing rigorous science and education around them.
Agreed. And before we kind of work towards wrapping, what's really, really, really exciting in this whole space for you right now?
Right now, one of the things I've been spending a lot of time on is looking towards the public and saying that, you know, we have this, what can sometimes feel like either a cocoon or a bubble of people working in psychedelics, and it's a lovely bubble and it's a lovely cocoon. It has some wonderful people in, but it's not necessarily representative of the broader population. So just in the last month or two, we've developed the first UC Berkeley psychedelic survey. So we did a nationally representative poll of US voters to try and understand what do ordinary Americans genuinely think and believe and hope about psychedelics, and how different might that be to sentiments and assumptions within the psychedelic space. And the results have kind of been really interestingly surprising. So one of the headline findings that we found, we asked people, have you heard something recently about psychedelics? And almost 50% of people said yes, which says to me that, you know, potentially fears that, you know, it feels like, especially living in the Bay Area, like everyone and their dog is microdosing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the news about psychedelics is filtering out the rest of society. But at least in this poll, we're finding that about half of people say, yes, they are hearing about stuff. And then we asked that half of the voting public, if you are hearing about this, what are you hearing? And the single most common answer was that they're being used for mental health treatments. So basically half of a half, so roughly a quarter, are hearing about psychedelics and noting that they're being used for mental health treatments. So it was something like 48% of people who have heard of psychedelics giving that answer. And that was something like 4 or 5 times higher than the next most common response, which is their illegal kind of dangerous substances. So there's a really strong salience out there that people are kind of hearing the news from research and hearing the news from the underground and hearing the news from patients, that there's a strong association here. We also asked people about policy change, and we found that over 3/4 of voters would support policies to make it easier to do psychedelic research. We found that 61%, so a clear majority, would support policy change to have a regulated framework for psychedelic assisted therapy. So again, that's a significant majority of the voting public saying, yes, people should be able to access this. And just for context, for issues like same-sex marriage and for cannabis legalization, it took decades. So 20 years, 30 years, 40 years in different contexts to get from opposition to being to a place where 60% of the public would back a policy change. And we're at that place right now. So we haven't got historic data on this. We don't know what the picture was 5-10 years ago. But the fact that we're already at more than 6 in 10 members of the voting public saying they would support policy change, I think is really exciting. There are some tricky parts there as well. So we also found that a majority of people said that psychedelics are bad for society, and psychedelics aren't for people like me. So there is still this sense that people are open to change and they're kind of interested in what might come, but they might still see it as something for someone else that has kind of potentially, jeopardizing important things in society, perhaps still seeing it as a fringe thing. So that's something to watch out for.
Be interesting to juxtapose that particular figure with like, is therapy for me?
Yeah, totally. But one of the other questions we asked was, have you or has someone close to you had an experience with psychedelics? So we didn't ask about personal use directly because that's potentially incriminating and we want to make it easy for people to give honest answers. But so we had this kind of slightly vaguer question of, you or someone close to you, have you used psychedelics? And again, we found almost half of the voting population said yes. So we're saying half the voting population has a first degree connection to psychedelics of some kind. But one of the interesting trends we found was the demographic breakdown between people that said yes and people that said no. So both the people who've heard a lot about psychedelics and who have that first degree connection, we found that the people that are overrepresented amongst those groups are white, they're male, they're liberal, they're highly educated, they're living in Western states of the US, they're aged between 30 and 50, and they have little to no weekly spiritual or religious practice. And the people that are underrepresented, the people that are more likely to say, I haven't heard about psychedelics and neither I nor someone close to me has any experience with psychedelics, they're more likely to be African-American, female, conservative, only having a high school education, residing in the south of the US, being either young, so 18 to 29 or 75 plus, and have a regular kind of weekly or monthly religious practice. So again, the word is getting out there and the research is kind of hitting the mainstream and people are becoming more aware and perhaps even more comfortable with psychedelics. But it is the story that you might expect in terms of the types of people who are more comfortable versus less comfortable. And I think that points to a potential bias in the way in which we're communicating about psychedelics, that the people who are doing the communication, the communities that are hearing them, the kind of media outlets that are carrying this stuff, it is kind of representative of a subset of the US population, isn't representative of the population overall. And I think that's a really big challenge for research and medicine for communication as well.
I think this might be some sort of final question. Have you had any interaction with the new psychedelic group at University of Exeter?
I've not actually. No, I know they kind of. Did they help put on Breaking Convention?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm buds with a lot of those folks, and they're a bunch of them are actually in Vermont right now with my whole community, which is really nice.
Oh, amazing.
And then, this whole idea of like philosophy and psychedelics, I find crucial too. But neuroscience and philosophy, like you're asking philosophical questions with neuroscience. That's kind of a fun overflow. But it's great that both sides of the Atlantic were having like really great conversations. And I hope a few other continents will join in a robust way soon. And I think they will.
I hope so too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anything else you'd like to mention?
Well, just on that philosophy point, I just wanted to kind of give it something that's been on my mind recently. One of the talks I really enjoyed at Psychedelic Science 2023 was by Manoj Das, who I think is kind of quite active on Twitter as well in terms of psychedelic research. And
sure is.
Yeah. And I found his talk really compelling because it really reminded me and reminded all of us of the brain's potential to fool itself. We come across this all the time in terms of simple things like optical illusions versus other things that kind of more in our day-to-day life. And it reminded me of the times in which I've felt that I've gained insight and that insight has proved to be illusory. And I think there's something tremendously powerful about psychedelics, which is that they can feel revelatory. They can feel like you've kind of gained this true understanding. And I've often come across the question in this space, well, why is it the case if psychedelics are meant to reveal truth and they're meant to also be suppressing ego? Why is it the case that there are so many divergent views about what the truth is in the psychedelic space and why there are so many huge egos in the psychedelic space? And I think it's important to come back to that question of, psychedelics may be powerful, but ultimately we are still really fallible. Our brains are fallible, we're fallible people, we're fallible creatures. And adding psychedelics into that mix doesn't necessarily lead to truth or any kind of perfection. It's adding in complexity and insight into a world in which we can never really be sure of our own insight and can never really be sure of what's going to come next. So it reminded me of how we all need to stay humble about what's going to happen in the future and how little we truly know about psychedelics and about ourselves.
So much good there. Yeah. Like the Terrence McKenna line about like the real message here is how comfortable can we become with uncertainty? And then there's the Tim Leary line, think for yourself and question authority, and including you. Like, you think that's true because you had this experience. You should probably investigate that thing that you think is true.
Yeah.
And it could perhaps reveal the, yes, we should be searching for truth, but truth is fleeting.
Yeah.
Truth is a really hard thing to land on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's this whole provisional march of progress, Yeah. Yeah. We believe this today, but 2 weeks from now, it could be totally invalidated.
Yeah. And I know different people have different interpretations of this word, but one word I hear a lot in the psychedelic space is the word sacred. People talk about sacred plant medicines and sacred practices. And I come to that word with a ton of baggage. Again, grew up very, very religious, had a real crisis with Islam, and still, culturally Muslim, but I don't practice and I don't believe. But for me, one of the things I walked away from that experience of kind of indoctrination with was an allergy to the idea that anything is sacred. For me, saying something is sacred implies that it can't be questioned, that it can't change, that it can't be picked apart and delved into and kind of wrestled with. And for me, that kind of the idea that nothing is sacred is really important. The idea that no matter how valuable you think something is, no matter how much insight it's given, no matter how much stock people put in it, the idea that it should still be able to be pulled from its pedestal and kind of pulled apart and delved into, I think is really critical. And I think that's true of psychedelics broadly. I think that's true of insight gained through psychedelics. I think that's true of individual psychedelic substances. So what you just referred to as kind of the incremental march and the openness to not knowing what the future looks like, I think is important.
Yeah. Well, Imran, thank you so much. This has been awesome. And I hope we can catch up again in the future because I'm sure the center is going to be doing some amazing things.
I hope so too.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.